All right. So, what I want to talk to you guys about is this concept that I've been really invested in over the past few weeks. Is this idea of mental models, right? And what a mental model is basically just a way about approaching a problem, right? So, if you're encountering situations in your life or in the world in general, how do we deal with those situations and those things, right? How do we actually think about thinking about those things? That is what the fundamental idea of a mental model is. And so what I did was I went out there and I pulled a few of the ones that I've been liking a lot recently. There's hundreds, if not thousands of these, but these are some of the ones that I found really impactful. So the first one is this idea that the map is not the territory. And what this means is, what do you do in those situations where you come to a fork in the road, right? We all have these maps laid out for us in different aspects of our lives, whether it's a way to build a family or a relationship or a way to act in a corporate career or a way to run a specific type of business. We all have these maps laid out in front of us. But the thing is, a map can never lay out every single detail in extreme fidelity all of the time, right? Because if it did, then it wouldn't be a map, right? A map necessarily does not have all of the details in there. And I think this is a really powerful way to look at things because the fact of the matter is, in life, you need to be able to pivot, you need to be able to make independent decisions on your own, right? You'll never have a world where every single decision all the time is laid out for you with a perfect response. And I think, especially when we're talking about like businesses, people do this all the time, all right? Where you get into a program, for example, and you're working hard, and then you encounter some situation where the exact series of steps hasn't been laid out for you, right? Maybe the landscape has changed a little bit, an algorithm thing has changed. Sometimes it's as basic as the UI inside of some app changes, and people tend to fold and just stop taking action entirely. And so I think this one again is really, really, really valuable. You have a map, but you have to adopt the mindset that the map can never map out everything for you in detail, right? It's never going to give you 100% fidelity or visibility into what the reality of a situation is, because it's impossible, right? It could never happen. So that's the first one. I really love this one. The map is the territory. Second of all, and this might be my favorite recently, is this idea of inversion, right? Or inverting a problem. And so what this basically means is when times get tough or when things get tough, you flip the script very literally. And so you can think of this as doing the exact opposite, or thinking of something from the exact opposite perspective, or starting from the end and thinking things through from the end. And so I think a really, really good example of this is cold calling, right? So in a lot of different types of businesses, you have to cold call, right? You have to cold call. And what a lot of people do in the beginning stages, especially if you're being coached, is you're going to set a goal, right? Like, I want 10 positive outcomes of a cold call every day to start building and nurturing opportunities. Well, for a lot of people, especially if they're new to sales, that idea of getting a yes to a cold call can be very punishing, right? It can be a very punishing thing. And so what's one way that we can invert that? Well, if we were to say, well, I'm going to go get 10 no's to cold calls, and maybe I'll stop if I get to 10 yeses first, it takes that thing that was an entirely negative outcome and it flips it and turns it into the thing that you're actually rewarding yourself for. So inversion is super helpful. Another way to think of this could be like in a relationship that you have, where maybe instead of saying, man, how much of this stuff am I going to put up with this person, saying, what am I specifically going to refuse to put up with in this relationship, right? Changes the paradigm of how you think about those things. Second one, this is probably the first like mental model or heuristic that I would think I was ever exposed to, or at least I can remember being exposed to, which is Occam's razor. So for anyone that doesn't know what Occam's razor is, basically this concept that the simplest solution is often the correct one, essentially. And so what happens a lot, again, especially in business, but in life in general, we try to we spend so much time complicating a situation that should actually be very straightforward. And there's a lot of reasons why this happens, especially when you start to consider like modern day marketing and strategies that people implement. They're meant to make things seem really complex because then they can provide you a solution to that problem. That is a very complicated thing, right? But in reality, the actual solution or the simplest solution to most problems is often the correct one, right? The thing that is very easy for you to do and makes sense and lacks tons of complexity is often the best one, right? It's often the best one for you to pursue. Inertia, right? For any physics majors out there or people that have taken physics, an object at rest stays at rest, right? And an object in motion stays in motion. And this is as much true, I think, in like a mathematical sense as it is in a how humans work, right? So you can see this a lot in your life. If you're a complete beginner, right? If you're a noob, the best thing that you can do is to start, right? And it sounds cliche because it's what people say all the time, but honestly, the best thing that you can do is to start, because once you start, you will continue to take action. But if you stop, you're going to stay in that position, right? Unless there's a lot of force that comes along and jolts you out of that situation. That's why it's so important that when you have momentum in something, that you keep that momentum going. And so if you're in something and you've slowed down, maybe again in business or in fitness or in anything really, if you've slowed down, what you need to do is you need to speed up before you come to the complete stop. There's an analogy I heard once, and I don't know where it was. If you were to take a train, right? So think of like a traditional like coal powered train or steam powered train or whatever. If you took a train and you put it on a track and you just put like a wedge in that track, right? So you imagine like a wedge that you shove under a door. If you were to put a wedge in front of the two front tires or whatever on the rails of the train wouldn't be able to start moving. It wouldn't be able to start. But if you took that same train and you put it on the track and you sent it barreling down the track at 50, 60, 70 miles per hour, it could smash through a concrete wall. And why is that? It's because momentum is energy, like in a very real sense. Momentum is energy. And so when you have that momentum and you're doing something, it's important to keep it going as best as you possibly can, because picking up and starting again from a stopping point requires a lot more energy from you, a lot more force to get that thing moving again. If you're a person that works out, for example, I'm sure you've seen this. When you're in there and you're hitting your workouts and you're doing the thing consistently, it's really easy to keep it going, right? But that moment you go on the vacation or you're sick and you're off for a week, it's really hard to get in there again and get that first rep in and then continue to do it each and every day afterward to get back into that system. And so a lot of the times this momentum that we have is like, it's emotional or like contextual. It's just some situation happens in our life that forces that momentum on us or whatever else happens. It doesn't really matter what the situation is. The thing is, when you have the momentum, you need to keep the momentum going, because if you begin to rest, there are odds you're going to stay in that rested position. Another one is bottlenecks, right? Everyone knows what a bottleneck is, right? The place where something flowing stops. I think a helpful thing to think about here is, where are your bottlenecks in whatever it is that you are trying to do? What is the critical path that must be true in order for you to succeed in the thing that you're doing? And where are you being held up in that process, in that path? Right? Because that's the thing that you need to ultimately work to clear out. And there's different ways that you can do this. One that I think is really helpful is this concept of like an Eisenhower matrix. If you've ever heard of an Eisenhower matrix, you should prioritize things that are important, things that are not important, things that are really urgent or critical, and things that are not really urgent at all or critical, right? You put them in like a little Punnett square, 4 boxes. and map out where each of your tasks actually sit in there, and then take priority towards the things that are your bottleneck. So again, if we're talking about like business, a lot of people are good at a specific thing, but not necessarily other things, right? It's the power of knowing your strengths and weaknesses. Someone might be really good at sales, or really good at marketing, or really good with copywriting, really good with creative, really good with something like that. You might be terrible at selling someone, right? Might be really terrible at building a website in WordPress or whatever it is. Yet we try to accomplish those things for whatever reason, when in reality, if we were to just take time to break down the bottlenecks in the things that are most critical for us to succeed based on where we're trying to go, we'll have a much higher likelihood of actually being successful. Another one, and I have a nice little XYZ on the slide. Nice attention to detail, Sean. So this comes from economics, right? Microeconomics, if you want to be specific. And it reminds me of a quote from a Rush song. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, right? And so it's kind of this idea of an opportunity cost. There's a cost to everything you do. And so there's the very obvious literal cost of something, right? If I was to, for example, go to a movie theater and buy a ticket, there's a cost associated with me doing that thing. But what most people don't usually think of is the opportunity cost of that same action, right? So if we were to think in the context, just like a kind of stupid example, if you were to think in the context again of the movie theater, you going to the movie theater and paying for the ticket, there's a very real cost to that. But there's also the lost cost or the opportunity cost of what else you could have been doing with that time, right? If you have a business, you could have been doing stuff in the business. I'm not saying that's where you should prioritize things, but just as an example, there's another cost associated with that thing. And so again, another concrete example, a lot of us would get into like a business opportunity or something like that, and we're so afraid of the cost of failure, right? We're afraid of doing the cold call or launching the first ad campaign or creating the first product that you want to drop ship or whatever it might be. We're afraid of the cost of that failure and what that means to us emotionally, but we don't consider, well, what is the cost of me not doing that at all, of not experiencing that other failure, right? What is the cost of me having to look the people in the face that I was supposedly doing this for and tell them I'm giving up on it, or that I can't make that thing happen for them, which was the entire reason I wanted to get into this thing in the first place, right? So there's this big opportunity cost concept. And I wanted to end this with some questions that are related to all of these, and I think they're kind of valuable. One of these actually isn't a question, but kind of is. I've heard this a lot recently. I don't know if it's in my Instagram feeds or whatever. What would you do if failure was not an option? And what I mean by that is, like, if you knew that, just imagine, like, as a thought experiment, if you knew that you could not fail, right? Just assume that that was true. How would your actions change day to day? So if we were to consider like you right now and the things that you know you should be doing that you're not doing, well, if you knew that you could not fail, right? There was some aspect of reality where you couldn't fail. How would your actions change in what you're trying to do? Right? And so you should honestly sit down and map that out as a thought experiment. If I knew I couldn't fail, here's how I would change. Here's what actions would change. Write those things down and then genuinely ask yourself, well, what is stopping you from doing that anyway? Because in reality, you only really fail when you quit, right? And so why aren't you taking those actions anyway? So that's a big one that I think you would all benefit from writing down and kind of reflecting on. The second one is a really good one as well. Just this concept of like, what are you willing to endure? Right? What pain do you actually want in your life? And what are you willing to struggle for? So a lot of us run into these situations where we have a lot of hardship and problems and pain, but the issue isn't that we don't want pain at all in our lives, right? Because pain is ultimately what drives people to change. It's that we're taking on all this pain and all these problems that we don't want in the first place. Or like, I don't want that type of stress. I don't want that type of struggle. I don't want that type of problem, but I'm willing to have all of these other ones. Right? So what pain are you actually willing to have in your life? And what are you actually willing to endure? And framing it that way, again, it's a form of inversion. Shout out to earlier slides, where instead of saying like, "Hey, what do I want? What benefit do I want in the future? What pleasure am I going after?" Saying, "What pain do I want?" Right? It's usually a much simpler set of things to think about when you boil it down. Third concept is this idea of the 4 life stages. So I heard this concept from a guy named Mark Manson. So there's 4 stages in life in general. When you're a kid, that stage is mimicry, right? You're usually just mimicking the world around you. You then move into self-discovery, where you're discovering who you are, the values you'll have, the principles you'll have. You then have commitment to that thing, that self that you have discovered. And then you have like the legacy that you'll leave on to others based on like the learnings from your entire life. And I thought it was a really interesting concept, but I think it applies like equally as well to what we're doing when we have a business, for example. And I think the thing that's really interesting about people that are beginners that never end up succeeding is they never make it out of this mimicry stage, and they don't even do it. They don't even do the mimicry, right? If you think going back to like the map, like we've laid out this entire process for people to follow, yet people do not follow it, right? And so it reminded me of like, imagine having a toddler, a child that's trying to learn how to speak, but they're never actually mimicking what they hear their parents and the world around them saying. They're just blabbering, right? They're never going to learn how to actually talk, right? If they don't see people walking, they're never going to connect in their mind that, hey, I can do that too. Let me try that, right? And so a lot of us get stuck in this phase where we're not even doing the basic things that we know will get us to 5 to 10K pretty easily. And instead, we're just lost in this constant wheel of questioning and not taking the action ultimately. And so we can't even get to that stage of saying, okay, cool. Well, here's how I specifically want to carve my business out. Here's the specifics of the values that my business is going to have. Here's how I'm going to act. Here's how that might be different, right? It's uniquely me. You don't get to that stage because you don't even get past the point of being able to just do the thing that you're told to do that will work. Which leads me into this last piece, which is the dichotomy of responsibility. And I'll be quick with this one. Are you taking the raw responsibility for your failures? I had somebody, different business, not related to this one, where we had an issue with payment processing stuff, which was our fault. And when we reached out to the person who had consumed the product already, they said that the fact that the payment didn't go through was a sign from God that they shouldn't do this. And therefore, they weren't going to make good on the original contract. They'd actually signed a contract. How crazy is that, right? What level of break with reality and inability to take responsibility for decisions that you've made does that represent? It's a pretty big one. So I hope this was helpful. It was helpful for me.